What is justice? What is the difference between right and wrong? What should we teach the young? These are hard questions, but they are questions the ancient Greeks thought all wise men should try to answer. The Greeks even invented a word that means lover of wisdom, philosophos, or philosopher. The pursuit of wisdom, sometimes called philosophy, is one of the lasting achievements of ancient Greek civilization.
Virtue?
One of the most important Greek philosophers was a man who said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." His name was Socrates, and you could find him arguing with people on the sidewalks of Athens during the 5th century BC.
Ever since this skunk set up shop here, he's made me work twice as hard.
So you say Simmias here is your enemy because he makes you work harder than you did before?
Wasn't that enough to make any man your enemy?
But an enemy is a man who does you evil, isn't he?
Any fool knows that.
And a friend is one who does you good.
Any fool knows that, too.
But what a fool does not know is what is good and what is evil. Now, you make better vases and you work harder because of Simmias' competition. Do you not, Protagoras?
This question and answer method of teaching is still known today as the Socratic method.
To talk to Socrates was to be taken down the garden path, at the end of which one finds that, alas, you don't know what you're talking about. So it's fun to read the works. You sympathize with the person Socrates is questioning, and you have a sense that this poor person is being had, but you don't know exactly how it's being done. Socrates is the master of this.
Socrates made a lot of enemies because he questioned many of the ideas people believed in. The leaders of Athens soon grew tired of being tripped up by Socrates' sharp tongue. In 399 BC, the 69-year-old philosopher was brought to trial for corrupting the young. Socrates was offered his freedom if he would just stop questioning people. He refused. He was condemned to die by drinking poison made from the hemlock plant. But the teachings of Socrates would live on thanks to his most famous student, Plato. Plato made Socrates the main character in more than 20 of his books, including The Republic, a series of imaginary conversations between Socrates and others. Plato was born during the Golden Age of Athens, around 428 BC. The newly completed Parthenon towered over the city, one of the crowning achievements of the world's first democracy. The first plays were performed, and the first great histories written. But it was also a time of devastating human loss. For the first 23 years of Plato's life, the Peloponnesian War raged between Athens and its neighbor Sparta. Plato thought there must be a better way to live. In his book, The Republic, Plato describes a utopia, an imaginary perfect world in which everybody gets one job for life and is assigned a social rank. There is no war because philosophers, of course, are kings. To ensure that this perfect world remains perfect, children are only allowed to hear heroic and uplifting tales. The famous national epics of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, are out because the gods behave badly and the heroes are flawed. How would you feel if your favorite movies and TV shows were banned because they were considered bad for you? Plato was serious about spreading his ideas. He even started a school called the Academy. The Academy's most famous student was a kid named Aristotle, who went on to tutor Alexander the Great. The writings of the Greek philosophers might have been lost forever after the Roman Empire collapsed, except for the work of Islamic scholars. They translated Plato into Arabic and passed his books through Egypt, India, Persia, and Spain. It wasn't until centuries later that the ancient texts finally reappeared in Europe. Philosophy, wrote Aristotle, begins in wonder. We still wonder about the same questions that Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle asked all those centuries ago. The quest for wisdom and justice is as important today as it was in ancient Greece. There once was a Greek warrior who wanted nothing more than to stop fighting and go home, to be with his wife, his son, and sleep in his own bed. Instead, the gods dealt a serious blow to his plans. Of course, the story of this warrior, named Odysseus, isn't true. It was made up by a Greek poet named Homer in the 9th century BC. But it's a story with a purpose, to explain a world filled with heroes, gods, and villains, the world of the ancient Greeks. The word mythology comes from the Greek word for storytelling. Before history and before science, myths were the stories people told to explain the world around them. The Odyssey is the most famous example of Greek mythology. It tells the story of Odysseus, who fought long and hard for Greece during the Trojan War. The Odyssey is about his attempt to return home to his wife Penelope and to the Greek island of Ithaca, where he is king. But his trip turns into a nightmare, a series of tests for the hero that puts him in one crisis after another. What should have been a 2-week trip from Troy to Ithaca ends up taking 10 years. It is these obstacles Odysseus must overcome that makes the book so exciting. It's a style of storytelling that still exists today. Think of action-adventure movie heroes like Indiana Jones. He's really just Odysseus with a hat. Trouble starts early for Odysseus and his crew when they land on the island of the Cyclops in search of food. Instead, they become food when this giant one-eyed monster eats some of the crew. Odysseus pays the Cyclops back with a sharp stick to the eye. He and the remaining crew escape, but as they're leaving, Odysseus can't resist bragging. He shouts, "The one who has blinded you! I am Odysseus, sacker of cities, king of Ithaca!" Big mistake. The Cyclops' father is Poseidon, god of the sea. Poseidon condemns Odysseus to wander the sea and face difficult tests. Odysseus is suddenly in for a long and dangerous trip. He lands on the island of the witch Circe, who turns his men into pigs. After a year, they finally escape, only to end up crossing the path of more dangerous women, the Sirens. The Sirens were a group of women who used their seductive songs to lure sailors to their deaths. Fortunately for Odysseus, he has been warned. He has himself tied to the ship's mast so he can resist their singing. Having escaped the Sirens, Odysseus and his crew soon find themselves between a rock and a hard place. The deadly whirlpool Charybdis and the 6-headed monster Scylla, who lives in a cave above the sea. Odysseus must make a choice. Which is the lesser evil?
He always has choices. He has the choice of going past Scylla or taking the route of the whirlpool, and he's been told that if he takes the whirlpool, it's most likely that the whole ship will be destroyed, sucked down into this terrible Charybdis. On the other hand, he knows that if he goes past Scylla, he will lose 6 men. So he decides not to tell his men about that, because he realizes that if they knew that 6 of them would die, they would stop rowing in that direction. And he tries to fight Scylla, but she cannot be fought. He has been told that too. And before he even sees her coming, Scylla has taken 6 of his men and is eating them up in the mouth of her cave. And he thinks this is the most horrible sight he's ever seen. But he gets through.
The reward for getting through is to become stranded on the island of Calypso, a goddess who causes Odysseus to fall under her spell. She keeps Odysseus in prison for 7 years before the god Zeus orders her to let him go. Between the Trojan War and the sea voyage, Odysseus has been away from home for 20 years.
The tales have a purpose. They are not repetitive. They show Odysseus facing a number of different challenges, and as he goes through these tales, in each one of them he is invited to forget the return home, to forget home, to stop living in a way, to die.
Finally, Odysseus reaches Ithaca. He comes home disguised as a beggar and finds that the young men of his kingdom have taken over his household. They want Penelope to give up on her husband and remarry.
The Queen.
Penelope proposes a contest to her suitors. She agrees to marry the man who can string Odysseus's bow and shoot an arrow through a dozen axes. The only man who can do it, of course, is Odysseus, still disguised as a beggar. After 20 years, he and Penelope are together again.
Odysseus' adventures, if we see them as tests, are much larger versions of the kinds of crises and problems and issues and adventures to which each of us is subject over the course of life. But what we all want, and what Odysseus above all has, is to be able to say, not only when he gets home, but when he's on his deathbed, man, I lived a life. And that's part of what makes him both such a rich source of entertainment and a kind of inspiration.
Yes, the Odyssey is a myth, but myth is not simply fiction. To the ancient Greeks, the gods who lived on Mount Olympus represented two things: the forces of nature like water, wind, and air, and the nature of man, desire, ambition, anger, and jealousy. Mythology taught the Greeks about the exploits of their heroes and the wisdom of their culture. It gave them an identity, a sense of national unity. And for the rest of us, Odysseus is the model for a kind of hero that still entertains and inspires us today.
"2,000 years ago, in the land surrounding the Mediterranean Sea, there was a vast empire, the Roman Empire. In this empire were grand cities, magnificent buildings, and riches of every kind. Rich emperors lived in palaces, and beggars lived on the street. Long roads connected all the cities of the empire, and all roads led to the capital, the grandest city in the world. All roads led to Rome. So let's step back in time to see what life was like in that ancient city. A day spent in ancient Rome would be a very full day, and it would start at sunrise. In these days before electric lights, it was necessary to get everything done while the sun was shining. That meant getting an early start to every day. Since the weather in Rome is warm most of the year, and since they were out when the warm sun was shining, Romans wore garments called tunics that left their legs bare. Most Romans had only one outfit that they wore every day, and it was rarely washed. The wealthy, on the other hand, wore draping pieces of fabric called togas over their tunics. And the most important Roman citizens wore togas with a bold, colorful stripe to make them stand out in the crowd. Finishing off a Roman outfit were sandals made of leather, not too different from the shoes of today. Roman homes were variations on familiar concepts as well. Very few people had houses of their own. But those who did lived in houses that were built around beautiful courtyards that may have even had swimming pools. Most people, however, lived in small apartment buildings that were made mostly of wood. For fear of fire, residents did not cook inside. They bought food already prepared, usually no more than soup and bread. Some people sat at tables, but most ate sitting on the floor. Mealtime in the homes of the wealthy was a different story. They ate large feasts and were served as they reclined on couches. Everyday Roman citizens would gather in the Forum, a busy square in the center of town. Romans could purchase goods from near and far using Roman coins called denarii. The Forum was abuzz with orators and politicians, holding lively debates and giving speeches. This would all be in the official language of the Roman Empire, Latin. Latin was not only used in spoken word, but also as a written script. They carefully carved words onto wax tablets, or they wrote with ink on papyrus scrolls made from plants that came from Egypt. It is from their writings that we have learned so much about their lives. For instance, we know that the Forum was only one place to visit in ancient Rome. There were also temples for worship, stadiums to watch races, theaters to see plays, and there were baths. The baths had pools of cool and hot water. The baths were a place to relax and socialize. For the poor, a visit was a rare luxury. The rich would visit every day. These are just some of the many things that we know about the way in which ancient Romans lived. Their detailed writings, their art, and their buildings reveal the habits of the extraordinary empire that ended centuries ago.
Around the 8th century BC, the Peloponnesus region in southern Greece was invaded by soldiers from the north. These invaders established a new city, Sparta, and their neighbors soon came to fear them. Sparta's warriors were so fierce, the city didn't need walls for protection. Other nations wanted Peloponnesus, a fertile valley sheltered by mountains. The threat of invasion from the Persian Empire and others was constant. Forever under the cloud of war, Sparta was an armed camp. Soldiers were the ruling class. At birth, a boy's strength and health were assessed. Those deemed weak were abandoned in the mountains. Those judged fit were taken from their mothers at age 7 to begin military training. At 20, he was made a soldier and joined a platoon. At 30, he could marry, as long as he remained devoted to affairs of state and the art of war. He could not farm or trade. These jobs were left to the slave class, known as helots, and lesser citizens, called freemen. At 60, a soldier finally retired, and a younger man took his place in the platoon. Sparta's single-minded devotion to war produced an army that could outdrill, outmarch, and outfight anyone. By the 6th century BC, Sparta was the dominant city in Greece on the strength of its brute force alone. Spartans fought in small, mobile platoons of fewer than 24 men. In battle, a Spartan warrior armored his torso with a bronze breastplate called a cuirass. His shins were also guarded by bronze. Strapped to his chest was an iron sword with a curved blade. A crested bronze helmet that exposed only his eyes protected his head. As an army, the Spartans used a new fighting strategy called a phalanx. Their phalanx was a massive formation of soldiers protected with shields. The right side of each man was protected by the shield of the man to his left. Sparta produced soldiers who could endure any hardship and confront death without fear. The term Spartan became synonymous with self-discipline and self-restraint. But centuries of fighting took their toll on Sparta. Costly wars with Persia, Athens, and Thebes eventually weakened the city. In the 4th century BC, Philip II of Macedon, father to Alexander the Great, conquered the region as part of his campaign to become master of Greece. By the 2nd century BC, Sparta was nothing more than a Roman province.
In 336 BC, a 20-year-old rose to the throne of Macedonia, a kingdom to the north of Greece in southeastern Europe. Within 13 years, Alexander III created the most powerful empire the world had ever seen and earned the title Alexander the Great. When Alexander was a boy, his father, King Philip II, brought all of Greece under his control. Alexander learned military skills and leadership from his father. But he also had another teacher, Aristotle, the legendary Greek philosopher. Aristotle gave Alexander a classical Greek education and taught him the importance of learning and the arts. When his father was assassinated, Alexander succeeded to the throne and began to plan the fulfillment of his father's most ambitious dream. One of Alexander's first actions as king was to put down a growing revolt in the Greek city of Thebes. He sacked the city as a warning to anyone who questioned his leadership. The news spread quickly. When Alexander's troops arrived in Athens, few opposed them. Alexander offered the Greeks a shrewd proposal. If they gave him men and supplies for his army, he would march against the Persian Empire and liberate the lands that the Persians had taken from Greece. In 334 BC, with his army of 35,000 Greek and Macedonian soldiers, Alexander began one of the most successful military campaigns in history. His troops won their first victory over the Persians at the Granicus River. They then swept across Asia Minor, taking city after city. In 333 BC, Alexander met the forces of the king of Persia, Darius III, in Issus in northern Syria. Although Alexander's army was significantly smaller than the Persians, superior tactics allowed him to claim victory and send Darius running. At the age of 23, Alexander could have returned to Greece a hero. Instead, he set his sights on capturing the rest of the Persian Empire. He next took control of Syria. and then turned his troops towards Egypt. The Egyptians welcomed Alexander. Like the Greeks in Asia Minor, they had suffered years of oppression under the Persians. Alexander's empire now covered about 500,000 square miles. In 332 BC, the Egyptians made Alexander their pharaoh, a title they gave to rulers they believed descended from the gods. From Egypt, Alexander drove eastward and won victory after victory. In 331 BC, he captured the Persian city of Babylon. Over the next few years, his army conquered the easternmost provinces of Persia. He then pushed even further east over the Hindu Kush into India before returning triumphantly to Babylon. Wherever Alexander and his army went, they brought with them the achievements of Greek culture. They built a new city on the banks of the Nile, Alexandria. Like cities in Greece, Alexandria's streets were laid out on a grid. Theaters, stadiums, temples, assembly halls, and a great library were built, all reminders of Greece. All across his empire, Alexander founded new cities, most of them named after him. In each, Greek soldiers and merchants settled down to live. In these cities, Greek culture mixed with Egyptian, Hebrew, Persian, and Indian influences to form the Hellenistic civilization. Alexander and his successors supported the work of scholars and artists. The palaces and public buildings of the Hellenistic world were often larger and grander than those of Greece. Alexander encouraged the blending of Eastern and Western cultures. He married a Persian woman and allowed Persian governors to administer portions of his empire. Alexander adopted many Persian traditions. He wore lavish Persian robes and demanded those approaching him to bow in the Persian manner. Alexander had marched 11,000 miles and traveled farther east than any European before him. It's said he wept because there were no worlds left to conquer. But in 323 BC, the man who had never lost a battle was struck down by a fever at the age of 33. Alexander died, and soon his empire crumbled. But the memory and cultural achievements of Alexander the Great lived on. Alexander's conquests spread Greek culture and led to the creation of Hellenistic civilization. This mixture of Western and Eastern cultures endured and thrived. The later Roman, Byzantine, and Islamic civilizations would all be fundamentally influenced by this Hellenistic world, a world forged by Alexander the Great.
Rome began as a small settlement along the Tiber River in Italy. Over time, it expanded to include the entire Mediterranean region, becoming the most successful empire the world had ever seen. When the Etruscan monarchy was overthrown in 509 BC, the new Roman leaders set up a form of government called a republic, or thing of the people. The most powerful governing body was the Senate, which decreed the laws. It consisted of 300 members from prominent families. The Romans created a large Senate because they wanted to prevent any single person from becoming too powerful. As Rome expanded its power, riches flooded into the country from trade and from conquered lands. Some Romans gained tremendous wealth, and a great gap grew between the rich and the poor. Corruption and greed became rampant and replaced the virtues of hard work and devotion to duty that had formed the basis of the Republic. By the 1st century BC, the Roman Republic was in serious trouble. Unemployment was widespread. Small farmers could not compete with wealthy estates, called latifundias, where slave labor was used to produce crops cheaply. And Rome's volunteer army of citizen soldiers had been replaced by professionals who were more loyal to the commanders who hired them than to the Republic. Amid this chaos, rival Roman generals from across the empire marched their armies into Rome, some to defend the government, others to overthrow it. Civil war broke out. In the meantime, an ambitious Roman commander was covering himself in glory. His name was Julius Caesar. Caesar had set out with his army in 59 BC. After 9 years of impressive victories, they had conquered Gaul, the area that is now France. News of Caesar's great achievement spread quickly. In Rome, the Senate feared Caesar's popularity. They ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome, but Caesar refused. Instead, he secretly led his army across the Rubicon River into northern Italy and marched on Rome. His arrival set off another civil war. When the fighting was over, Caesar had won. To celebrate, he hosted a banquet for 22,000 of Rome's poorest citizens. The people celebrated Caesar's victory, and the Senate was forced to vote him the powers of a dictator. Caesar was not Rome's first dictator. In the past, the Senate had sometimes appointed a dictator during times of war. These dictators had given up their power voluntarily after 6 months, but Caesar had different plans. Caesar used his new power to address many of Rome's problems. Between 48 and 44 BC, he began a number of important reforms that helped the poor and drew up plans to reorganize and strengthen the empire. His reforms included giving free grain to the hungry, work to the jobless, and land to poor farmers. He planned a road system across Italy, made changes to how provinces were governed, and extended Roman citizenship to many conquered people. Caesar became even more popular with the common people, and more hated by many senators. They feared that Caesar would try to make himself king. In 44 BC, these senators' fears were realized when Caesar asked the people to elect him dictator for life. If they were to save the Republic, many senators believed they would have to eliminate Caesar. On March 15th, when Caesar arrived at the Senate, his enemies ambushed him and stabbed him to death, a total of 35 blows. The common people were outraged. After Caesar's death, Rome plunged once more into civil war. Caesar's reign had changed Rome and the views of its people. Now they would rather have the real gifts of a dictator than the promises of a republic. The fighting raged for 13 years. At last, in 31 BC, Octavian Caesar, Julius's grandnephew, emerged victorious. The Senate acted quickly to recognize Octavian as head of state. They granted him absolute power for life. He took the title Augustus, or Exalted One. Although it was not officially proclaimed, the Republic had ended. In its place was the new Roman Empire. Caesar Augustus was its first emperor. Augustus used his new powers cautiously, retaining many of the forms of the old republic, while concentrating power in his own hands. At the same time, he turned over many of the day-to-day tasks of running the government to a competent civil service. In this way, he left himself free to devote his energies to improving and strengthening the empire. Generally, Augustus and his successors used their unlimited power to give the Romans what they wanted. They erected aqueducts to provide a steady supply of fresh water, built new roads to improve trade, and granted more rights to the people living in the provinces outside Italy. And the emperors gave the masses bread and circuses, free food, and lavish entertainments to suppress any discontent. But some emperors abused their power. Rome's third emperor, Caligula, demanded that people address him as a god. He routinely tortured and executed his enemies. After his death, a rumor spread that he had given his horse a manger of ivory and appointed it to a high government post. The excesses of Nero, Rome's fifth emperor, may have surpassed even Caligula. The Roman people blamed Nero for setting a fire that destroyed much of Rome, just so that he could have a hand in rebuilding the city. He further used the fire as an excuse to persecute Rome's Christians, accusing them of starting the blaze. Despite these abuses, the Roman Empire prospered for 200 years. Beginning with the reign of the first Emperor Augustus, Romans enjoyed the Pax Romana, or Roman peace. During this time, Rome's power reached its height, and Romans enjoyed a period of peace and prosperity longer than any Europeans had ever known.
More than 1,000 years ago, people settled in villages along the coast of Peru. Mostly fishermen, they slowly expanded their settlements inland, where they farmed in the river valleys that run up into the highland plateaus. The dry, barren lands of the Atacama Desert in southern Peru seem like an unusual home for settlers, but archaeologists have found evidence of a thriving culture. A people known as the Chiribaya lived here between AD 900 and 1350. They lived in large houses made of cane and mud. Builders constructed complex irrigation systems that brought water to farms where farmers cultivated beans, peppers, and squash. The Chiribaya eventually disappeared, but more than 600 years later, bioanthropologist Sonia Guillen and her team of archaeologists are searching Chiribaya burial grounds for clues to their way of life. Many bodies have been naturally preserved as mummies for centuries. For these archaeologists, the mummies are silent yet powerful messengers from another time. The salt and chemicals in the Atacama Desert helped preserve the bodies. The skin and wool that surrounds them are intact despite being buried for hundreds of years. The mummies are more than just relics from the past. They show how people lived in the desert hundreds of years ago. Archaeologists think that the Chiribaya may have learned how to farm Peru's desert lands from members of the Chavin and Mohican civilizations. But the Chiribaya were more than just farmers. Their wool clothing is proof that the Chiribaya kept domesticated llamas and used their wool to design beautiful textiles. They were skilled fishermen and also worked with gold and other metals to make beautiful jewelry and ornaments. The Chiribaya took great effort to keep the bodies intact because they believed that preserving a body would allow its spirit to live on. They also buried many items with the body, objects they believed the deceased would need in the afterlife. Many decorated ceramic pots were discovered. During a person's life, the vessels were used to carry water or possibly for cooking, but in death, they have become valuable links to the past. Food offerings were also part of the Chiribaya burials. Even though they are hundreds of years old, the corn, potatoes, peppers, and grain on this plate still look like those found in modern-day Peru. Everything the archaeologists recover is brought to the Centro Malqui Research Complex. It houses a remarkable collection of ancient peoples from the Western Hemisphere. Some 400 mummies and the skeletal remains of another 4,000 Chiribaya are carefully cataloged and stored here. The dig season is almost over, but Dr. Guillen and her team have found one last tomb. The position of the roof stones indicates a well-constructed burial chamber. The rectangular tomb holds a mummy, intact and tightly bundled inside a striped blanket. It's just a short truck ride to the research center, yet it's a journey unlike any this Chiribayan could have imagined. Once inside the research center, Dr. Guillen and her team prepare to learn more about their new arrival. Inside the Central Malki darkroom, the X-rays develop in minutes. The X-ray also shows the outline of what looks like a small pot with a handle.
If I'm reading correctly, this is inside the chest cavity. See, the ribs are sort of embracing the...
curving around.
Yeah, curving around the pot. Now, I've seen other cases where they've taken out the lungs, the liver, everything. They've cleaned it thoroughly, and they put wool and artifacts inside. So I would bet this is an embalmed body, and I think it's worth it unwrapping this bundle to confirm this. We've had very few of these cases here.
Not every mummy is unwrapped at the time of its discovery. Some are stored intact for future examination. But the artifact revealed by the X-ray is a valuable clue that this body may have been artificially prepared, an uncommon procedure for the Chiribaya. Scientist Ron Beckett has brought an endoscope with him to Peru. With the device, he and Sonia can examine the interior of the mummy to confirm the location of the ceramic pot shown in the X-ray.
Are those leaves?
This is, yes.
That is a leaf inside there. Coca leaves, sort of coca inside and outside.
Yeah, there's a forest of leaves here.
Oh, wonderful. This is...
Right.
You know, coca being...
Trying to get a better shot.
Being a sacred plant and really important part of Andean rituals, you know, it's really not surprising to find it outside the body, inside the body, all around this funerary activity connected to this processing of the body. He probably was 60, 70 years old. He must have been very important for other people as they put so much effort and so much time on making sure that he could still be part of their lives after he was gone.
The most effective technique for assessing the age of ancient artifacts is carbon-14 dating, but Central Malki doesn't have the technology needed for the process. Sonia must ship her samples to Geochron Laboratories in Boston, Massachusetts. Plants and all other living organisms, including humans, continue to take in carbon-14 until they die. Once the organism dies, it ceases to absorb carbon-14, so the amount of carbon-14 in its tissues steadily decreases. As the carbon-14 extracted from the cocoa leaves is counted, a curve builds on the graph. The higher the curve, the larger the amount of carbon-14 in the sample, so the younger the material.
For cocoa leaves, we already calculated it. It's 600 years plus minus 40.
That dates the mummy's time of death somewhere between 1350 and 1450, close to the end of Chiribaya culture. In the years ahead, Dr. Guillen and other scientists will continue to study artifacts and mummies that date from all phases of Chiribaya history. These messengers from the past will help create a more detailed picture of this lost civilization.